He has worked in a number of capacities in the Mid-Atlantic. He is not only our former president of the Mid-Atlantic region, he went on to serve as our communications chair and membership chair. After those duties had been relinquished, he's now serving in the capacity of our regional representative, national regional representative. So I invite at this time to the podium Adisa Bektimba.
Hotep. Mom Franklin, do I have permission? Thank you. Our first presenter is Dr. Valethia Watkins Beatty. She is the daughter of James and Gloria Watkins. She is originally from Detroit, Michigan. At present, she is an assistant professor in the Department of History at Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta, Georgia. She is a recent past national secretary of the Association of Black Women Historians. Okay. Valethia research focuses on examining and researching the destructive and negative impact of using feminist-centered theories and feminist-informed ideas to frame, guide, and determine how research is done on African women, by extension of African people. She is the proud wife of Mario Hollis Beatty. Dr. Valethia is one of our young scholar warriors. She's a hard worker, and I guess we would put her in our third generation, since Doc Ben was born the same year as my father. So I think I'm in the second. I think Valethia is around the age of my daughter, so she's in the third. And I see some young folk in here that are in the fourth. You know, so we talk about the intergenerational transmission of knowledge. So at this time, we want to give a warm Ascac African welcome to Dr. Valethia Watkins Beatty.
Hotep. I would like to begin by asking permission of my elders to continue to speak. Ashe. I am now, as always, deeply humbled and honored to once again have the opportunity to stand before you, the Ascac family, and to share in the conversation, the work, and the struggle to build a new future for African people. I want to say how honored I am to stand before so many of my elders whose feet I sat at and continue to sit at as we pass on the baton and pass on the information. Not that we're ready to retire them, but those who have worked so diligently and so hard deserve our efforts in helping them to continue on. I want to thank Queen Nzinga, the Mid-Atlantic region, the local Ascac chapters, and everyone who labored and worked so hard to give us another successful conference. So let's give everyone who worked so hard a round of applause. The title of my presentation today is Retaking Their Fame, Radical Women in Our History. Specifically, what I'm going to focus on in the limited time I have is the politics that we must confront in writing, reconstructing, and rebuilding our knowledge of African women's history. Specifically, I'm going to focus on two preliminary challenges that I see as necessary that we confront in order to clear the intellectual space needed to write and rewrite this history of our female ancestors, and by extension our collective history, from an African-centered perspective, and B, from a perspective that allows the ancestors themselves to speak. Because too often their stories have been co-opted and pressed in service in the use of others who have a different agenda and who are at cross purposes from what we are at in terms of using those females' ancestors and their historical story. The two challenges that I want to focus on today, the first one being the need to decenter feminism in the writing and reconstruction of African American women's history and African history in general. And second, to deal with the problem that Dr. John Henry Clark talked about, and that is the colonization of information, specifically relative to African women. And I'm going to start with one of our most powerful female ancestors to frame my discussion today. And I want to start with Sister Ida B. Wells Barnett. Now, Ida B. Wells Barnett is one of our uncompromising female ancestors. Someone who stood on principle when it wasn't always popular. Someone who exhibited lifelong commitment to the struggle of African liberation. Particularly, I want to focus on giving some general background of Ida B. Wells and then using her words themselves to give us a charge of what it is we should be doing and providing a model of how we can do it. First of all, Ida B. Wells was born in 1862, and then she made her transition in 1931. As you know, she was instrumental in initiating the anti-lynching campaign after her three friends were lynched for merely being successful economically and creating a grocery store that was in competition with the right grocery store across the street. And they were brutally assaulted and lynched, and their life were taken from them. It got Ida B. Wells to start thinking about the falsehoods that had been put out about lynching and the reasons behind lynching. And one of those reasons was the false claim of black men raping white women. And Ida B. Wells, through her investigative journalism, disproved the fact that that was in actuality the cause of the lynching. That in fact, based on her analysis, she uncovered the fact that it was not only black men being lynched, that also black women and black children were being lynched. And that oftentimes the charge of rape was not even at the center, but the fact that economic competition or any little reason was behind that heinous act against black people. And Ida B. Wells, in publishing her findings, put her life at risk. That once she began to uncover the fact that oftentimes European women were chasing after black men and having and initiating relationships with them, once she published that fact and what she called the threadbare lie that black men were raping white women, a lynch mob came after her. They destroyed her offices, and they put a price on her head. So for over 30 years, she was unable to return back to the South. But one of the things that she gave us as a motto is one of the statements that she said, and that is, she promised and vowed to sell her life as dearly as possible. She said, I will sell my life as dearly as possible. What does she mean by that? She was trying to say that black life, African life, is valuable. And if people don't recognize that, then we have the duty, the obligation, in fact, to make them recognize that. And so when she said that in the face of the harm that was put before her in speaking the truth, that she cannot stop what other people's reactions were going to be toward her. In other words, she cannot stop a lynch mob from coming after her. But she vowed that she was going to sell her life as dearly as possible, meaning she armed herself with a pistol and promised any lyncher and any lynch mob that if anybody come to take her life, she's going to take 2, 3, or more with her. In doing that, she said that is the only way to make them come to value black life. If they realize that every time they take one of our lives, that somebody should not have to go alone, that you should take somebody with you. Ida B. Wells is particularly relevant to us at this historical moment as people focus and commemorate and talk about what happened in September the 11th in New York and Washington, D.C. And if Ida B. Wells was with us today, I believe that she would be the first to stand up and to proclaim to this nation that 911 is not, in fact, the first act of terrorism on American soil. That it is important that we educate our students, educate our youth, educate our family members, educate our community, that every time that they bring up 911, and yes, African people lost their life in 911, and we mourn the life if you're a human being of other human beings. But the point is, we cannot let people devalue our lives and our experience. Slavery, the enslavement of African people for over 200 years was domestic terrorism. The raping and lynching of black women, men, and children was domestic terrorism. The body count is too large. The crime so long. As Randall Robinson talks about, it's one of the longest violation of the crime against humanity that many of us find it difficult to wrap around our mind around the longevity of the acts of terrorism, police brutality. So we have to, it's incumbent upon us to always bring up the Ma'afa, to always bring up the lives lost by black people in the struggle for black liberation as acts of terrorism on American soil. One of the books I would recommend if people have not had the opportunity to take a look at it is the book called Without Sanctuary. It was an exhibit in New York. It is now an exhibit in Atlanta, Georgia, or will be at the Martin Luther King Center. One of the things that Mario did was purchase the book from the half-price bookstore, then cut the pictures out and had them laminated at Kinko's so that we could set up exhibits for our students in our classroom, which we have done systematically, so that our kids are exposed to these images, that they see what happened in a very graphic way. And those pictures are just the tip of the iceberg. For those who have not seen the book or are not aware of the book, Without Sanctuary presents the images of African people who were lynched in the South. And it shows you images of men, women, and children and the brutality that they experience. Now, the images are very harsh. They're very graphic. They are sometimes difficult to look at. But we have the duty, the obligation to force ourselves to confront what it is that our ancestors lived through. And part of that is to say that you did not die in vain, that you are not forgotten, and that we will remind the world of our story. It is our obligation to do that. And so those pictures have been extremely effective, that when you give, or I've given discussions about lynching and our youth, because they're not going to show those images on television. As a matter of fact, before they brought the images to Atlanta, they had a series of community forums trying to decide whether or not to even show the pictures. Now, they wouldn't have that same kind of discussion in terms of showing graphic images of the Holocaust. But when it comes to our Ma'afa, they wanted to say, well, should we show them, should we not show them? And Emory did not want to bring them to their campus, even though they have control over the exhibit. So they decided to move it into the community. But it's just important that our students and our youth, and many of us, see those images. One of the things that I found striking about it is not only does it connect the students on a very real level to our experiences, where it's not just abstract lecture anymore, that they begin to see, hey, this was somebody's significant other, somebody's son, somebody's daughter, somebody's brother, sister, father, mother, that is missing as a link within the community and what that means for them. All right, but aside from the very graphic nature, it was very interesting to watch the fact of, or to learn, in one sense, how exposed our youth are to violence and images of violence, in the sense that they were desensitized to the images. In other words, they didn't really recall, like, oh, you know, in that sense, not that they were insensitive, because they were very respectful. They took their time with each photograph. They asked questions. And so they were very into learning about this aspect of our history. But they have been so exposed to so many graphic images of violence that they can look at decapitation, et cetera, and so on. And it's just, you know, like they're medical examiners. who do this on a daily basis. But that book is very important, and those images, any images like that, that we have a visual representation in our mind's eye of those experiences that we have gone through. Ida B. Wells wrote her autobiography. She began writing it in 1927. It's called A Crusade for Justice. And I like to start with her story as to what motivated her, in a particular experience that motivated her to begin to write her own history, why she found it necessary. Now, her book was published in 1970 after she made her transition. Her daughter, Alfreda Duster, edited the text and went ahead and published it. But in the preface, she recounts a story about a young woman who comes to her and asks her, would you please tell me what it is that you did? How did you become such an important person within African history? In other words, I've heard your name often, but I don't know very much about you and what you've done. And many of our kids and many of us are not here, but us as a collective community outside these walls are in the same position. We hear names like Malcolm X or Martin Luther King, et cetera, and so on, but beyond the little slogan, I have a dream, or by any means necessary, how many of our people can really recount what they stood for, their ideology, and what activities they actually engaged in? This young woman had been in the 1920s in a setting where she was the only black person in the room. She was with all European people, and they asked her to name someone who was as great as Joan of Arc, who had the traits of bravery, who fought for the liberation of her people. And so rather, she didn't want to sit there and all these other European students are naming off people. And so the only name that came to her was Ida B. Wells Barnett. And so when they pressed her, like, how does Ida B. Wells Barnett rank with Joan of Arc? How can you put them in the same breath? In what way does she have the kind of traits that Joan of Arc had? The student came to Ida B. Wells and said, you know, I was pressed and I was embarrassed. So could you please give me the information so that the next time I'm faced with that situation, I can give an intelligent answer? And so Ida B. Wells looks and reflects on the fact that, you know, many of the activities she did, particularly the anti-lynching program, began in 1892 before this young woman had started. And that she, at that time, looked at the resources that were available to young people to know about the history of their fathers and grandfathers and mothers and grandmothers, that information was not readily available, in the sense that many of the participants in that history had not taken the time to write their story, to write what it is that they did. And she talks very highly of the black men and women of that time period and said that moment in history reflects well on the race and brings glory to the race. But many, failing to write, we are letting down the next generation when we don't engage in that intergenerational transmission of knowledge by writing our stories down and systematically passing that information to the next generation. So it is that young woman coming to her and asking her that question that gives Ida B. Wells the motivation to begin to write her particular story, but by extension, the story of the glory of African people in terms of those who stood shoulder to shoulder, male and female, in concert with one another, fighting for the liberation of black people. And so Ida B. Wells makes one statement that I think is important to us here in Ascac, and she says, our youth are entitled to the facts of race history, which only the participants can give. I am thus led to set forth the facts contained in this volume, which I dedicate to them. And I think Ascac has certainly, along with Ida B. Wells and those who came before her, demonstrated a commitment to the intergenerational transmission of knowledge. That is one of the reasons I stand before you, providing the space and providing the knowledge to build for eternity and to build our understanding of who we are as a people and what it is that we must do for those who are coming after us and those who are yet unborn. Two ways that Ascac are demonstrating that commitment. One is the African World History Project, which the first volume, as was spoken about this morning, has been published and now is available in paperback, and we should all support the African World History Project. And we all have a role to play, as Dr. Carruthers and others will talk about in the future, but in particularly, we're talking about people recording their local histories, talking about your wherever region and part of the country you're from, whatever community that you represent, whatever family, whatever lineage. Taking the responsibility of gathering the information for your particular lineage and writing that history and submitting that written history to the African World History Project, which will be a part of a larger volume on the different communities. In addition, we're going to initiate something here called the Ascac Oral History Project. And this is very, very important. We're very excited about the Ascac Oral History Project. What we intend to do is to begin to collect through oral histories and interview of the members of Ascac, to begin collecting the stories, the experiences, to begin to preserve the information necessary to write a comprehensive history of the organization and its members. So we ask that you all enthusiastically cooperate with this project by sharing of yourself, sharing your time, sharing your memories, that you all begin to gather your photos, gather your videos, your audio tapes, and reflect on your experiences. And so this is just the beginning. Of course, the Oral History Project, with the size of our organization, is a long-term, ongoing process. But we're going to begin here at this conference, at this national meeting, some of the preliminary test interviews. And we have some outstanding students from both Howard University and the Philadelphia Public Schools. First of all, I want to ask all the Howard University students who are going to participate in the project to please stand. We thank you so much. This is the future. These students have dedicated themselves and volunteered to be apprentices and our budding historians to help in the data collection of the oral history interviews. And we have some high school students from the Philadelphia school system. So this is truly going to be college, high school, and older people working together in an intergenerational link, preserving the history of Ascac. So as people come to you and tap you and ask you to participate in interviews, we ask that you be willing to do that. And in addition, as I say, here is just the start. This process will continue in the regional meetings, and it will continue at future national meetings, where Ascac begins to record the facts for our youth, to pass on a written record and build a monument for those who are going to come beyond us.
Thank you.
Now, how is that relevant to us today? It's important because as we look at the writing of Black women's history, that is a particular battlefield that we have to confront, and that is others appropriating the story, rewriting the history of the relationship of Black men and women that has profound effects of how we think about, how we talk about, and how we relate in relationships. One way is to focus, every time you think of male-female relationship, you think of it in the narrowest sense of some kind of either boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, etc. So, and not in the broader sense. When we say male-female relationship, we don't think of mother to son, brother to sister, father to daughter. So we have to expand our conceptualization of what we mean by male-female relationship, first off. Second, we have to seize control of the conversation and stop letting other people lead that conversation and us internalizing and picking up a fight that is not our fight. Now, we have many things to fight about. We have a lot of baggage to deal with, so we don't have to deal with other people's baggage. We have a history of relating to each other in a healthy way. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have the Urugu virus in us, and we don't have problems to deal with. But we don't have to go through feminism to deal with those problems, which is not a solution to the problem, but instead is compounding the problem and making it worse. You have before you, as you exist in Ascac, an alternative model, a story that is not out there, a story of the interaction in a positive and healthy way of female-male leadership that is not in competition, that is not adversarial, not as based on a conflict model. All right, so we have to get this story out. We're being under female leadership, collective leadership of men and women, and it has led to the positive growth. And so Ascac is one of those premier African organizations that provides a model to African communities if we get that story out. It is important that we interpret our story, because as you look at the story that's being written of the 1960s, of the Black Civil Rights Movement and the Black Liberation and the Black Power Movement, all being twisted to serve the purpose of building a case for feminism, as opposed to building knowledge of ourselves. When we look at it as a counterexample, when people look at the history of that whole suffrage movement, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, whenever they start talking about the vote, that is one example of a distorted story. But when they start talking about that story, the definitive voice becomes those two women. Why? Because in the middle of their struggle, before they achieved victory, they sat down and wrote a 6-volume history of the women's suffrage movement from their perspective, telling their lies and perpetuating their falsehoods that people now rely on as the definitive story to talk about that historical moment. And so what we need is those people who participated in the 1960s struggles, those who are participating in this struggle, those who participate in struggles before that, to begin to write our history. And even if you're not in the mood to write, others can write it for you. We just need to record you and record your experiences. But don't let that wealth of information go with you when you leave us physically. The history is important because it is important for us to move beyond the battle of the sexist paradigm, the gender war paradigm, starting from the notion that the history, all of the human history of male and female is really just the story of the gender rivalry, the fight, the conflict, the antagonism between men and women. Because if that was our story, then we would not have survived the Maafa that we survived. We would not have been able to build the communities that we built. Now, conflict exists wherever you have human beings. And so that is not the story. The story is, what are the institutions and the things you put in place to help resolve and help mediate conflict between people, all right? And so the starting point, we have to begin to look at those assumptions that they give us that come along with as an integral part of feminism as the real problem. Feminism is not just this notion of being pro-woman and women being empowered, but in addition, it tells you an explanation embedded or as part of its assumption, an explanation of who men are relative to women. The first problem is it defines men as the other, delinked from women, as the cultural other, the outsider. So our men are redefined as the outsider, and European women are defined as the insiders, our sisters. So we begin to use political terms to talk about black men and family terms to talk about white women. All right. The problem with that, as you can see, politics is based on, in this context, not cooperation, but conflict. So you begin to talk about whether or not you're going to have black men as allies. And you begin to redefine white women as an extension of yourself. So when she does well, that's you. But when a black male does well, that's anti-you. That's just another male hogging the resources for himself. You see the trick? All right. And in addition to defining black men as the other, as not an extension of ourselves, they define black men as our ultimate arch enemy. Now, it's not politically correct for them to call men the enemy, because as long as they did that, as many black women who want a man was anti anything that was going to be anti them being around men. But their fundamental principle is that men are anti-women, that men hate women, and that men think they're superior to women. All right. But that notion that hatred is what motivates all of their behavior is at the center of their analysis, and it informs what it is that they do. When we talk about one of the reasons why people are hesitant to deal with feminism is the level of hostility, anger, bitterness that it fosters and promotes between men and women. So everybody will come to the table and say, we got issues, we need to deal with those issues. But what people are against is the level of mean-spiritedness, the level of anger, and the level of hostility that exists. But they say that that is justified because men are the enemy. That is justified because the things that men do against women as a group is intentional and deliberate. Now let's contrast that to how they talk about what it is that European women have done historically to black women and black men. Now when they talk about that, what European women did was not intentional, it was misguided. It was unintentional, it was out of ignorance. They are ignorant to white supremacy. That's one of the things that Bell Hooks said, that white women are ignorant to white supremacy. So they didn't know better. And so in underestimating the intellectual and political acumen of white women, in other words, and underestimating their ability to manipulate reality, people have been disarmed relative to white women, to treat them childlike, to treat them as irresponsible or non-responsible for what they did. And when I mean what they did, their role in maintaining white supremacy, their vested interest in white supremacy. Because while they're encouraging you to view your man as the enemy, you just look at their behavior. Look at their behavior, the Democrats to the Republicans. One lesson we need to learn is, even though it's fake, it works for them, and that is, in the face of an enemy, they stand united. They come together whenever their survival is at stake. They say time out on the fight. Now, it's only barely contained temporarily, but it's a necessary ingredient for survival. And it's a lesson that we have to learn, that people continue to put, it's in their interest to put issues before us to divide and conquer. So when they talk about, well, you know, you're focusing on race and race issue, and you're not focusing on gender issues, you know, we feel obligated to say, oh, we're focused on race and gender issues. But that trick is they're redefining race for you. That's right. Based on something that's going to benefit them, because they feel the need to link with black women, not because they care, but because they need to use you as a shield to grab the power and the interest they have for themselves. So race issues become what? You focusing on the survival of your sons and your daughters. But that's not a gender issue. What's a gender issue? Their ability to define reality and have other people respond to the reality is power, as Wade Nobles and others have told us. And so we have to seize the ability to define our reality. You know, to stop focusing on skin color and talk about the African family. That's right. To look at who is your constituency. When you're talking about race, you're talking about who your constituency is, on whose behalf you're fighting for, and who you're accountable to. Dealing with a range of issues. All right. So when you say a women's issue, so ending racism is not a women's issue. Who defines it? And the notion of women's issue is something we should move beyond. Why? Not because the issue or whatever, if you say domestic violence, or if you say child care, or if you say birth control, is not important, but that it is a collective issue. It's not just her issue. It's not about women's work. It's our work. It's our issue. So just like they say it takes a village to raise a child, it takes a village to solve these issues. And that we should be focusing on not on a person's body type, but where they stand relative to the issues. And if they are doing my eye and about my eye, then we're all on the same side against those who are against my eye. Bringing it back to the politics of writing Black women's or African women's history, it is important that we clear the intellectual space to bring forth the diversity in Black women's thought. African women are not a monolithic group. Just like other people, we have diverse opinions, differing perspectives, sometimes opposing perception. And why should it be otherwise? Our political commitments, our ideological beliefs, our ideological ideals span the entire spectrum of political thought, just like other people. But often when you look at the scholarship done under the guise of women's history or women's studies, that diversity of thought is erased. So that people equate women's history with feminist history and treat them as one and the same. Treat them as synonyms, where women's history and feminist history are two separate and distinct things. And it becomes important for us to press the fact that women's history and feminist history, or women's studies and feminist studies, are not one and the same thing. Too often, people in this field promiscuously slap the label feminism on anybody who is a woman. Regardless of what they thought and what they did, everybody becomes feminism. So under the present construction of what women's studies is in the academy, it is reduced to one or two things. It is either reduced to the study of feminist women, by which everybody, Ida B. Wells and whoever else, are arbitrarily and indiscriminately labeled feminists. Everybody gets that label. Or it's the study of women from a feminist perspective, which results in the same thing. So let me give you an example. There's a recent biography out, well, relatively recent, on Shirley Graham Du Bois, who was married to W.E.B. Du Bois, his second wife. It's called Race Woman, The Many Lives of Shirley Graham Du Bois. And the author came to Atlanta Auburn Research Library to do a presentation on his book. And as I had read his book, one of the things that jumps out at you is the fact that Shirley Graham Du Bois was not a feminist. She disagreed in many fundamental ways with feminism, and he alludes to this fact. But what he doesn't do is give you her words, her position, brings forth the information which he had access to. He instead chooses to call her a feminist, even though he recognized the fact that she disliked that term and did not view and describe her politics in that manner. He goes on anyway and calls her a feminist. And in addition, he interprets her relationship to powerful Black men from a feminist perspective. In other words, it shapes how the meaning he attaches to those relationships. And I asked him, you know, how do you reconcile the fact that here you are doing a biography on this Black woman and you have the information to bring forth her views and you allude to her views, but yet you choose to call her a feminist? Why would you do that? Well, he begins, first of all, with the starting point that most people do, and that's this very loose, very arbitrary definition of feminism. He said she was a powerful, strong Black woman. By definition, that's feminist. All right. And I said to him, but one can be powerful, one can be strong, and not advocate feminism. In other words, not have those assumptions and beliefs as you interpret the world. So the two are not synonymous with one another. In addition, he basically, once he got past that point, he said to me that you'll one day understand the politics of publication. And part of the process is that when you write a book, that the publisher sends your book out for blind review. In other words, other experts in the field review and critique your book. And you don't know who those people are but you have an obligation to look at what it is that they said. And he said everything that came back was, she's a feminist, talk about her as a feminist, interpret it this way, etc. and so on. And he was like, you know, I needed my book published, you know, and basically he gave, well, sold out, okay. Yeah, he did that. He sold out her views. In other words, he didn't let her speak, but instead allowed her to be co-opted for the use of other people. So it is important for us to take the view that women's studies and feminist studies are not the same thing. And it's important for us to begin to press forward our ability to speak about our historical legacy from our own perspective. I recently went at Spelman College, Bell Hooks came and gave a presentation. That was my first time hearing her speak. I don't know if anybody in here has heard her speak before. It was very interesting. She's done a trilogy on love and commitment, loving relationships. But as she talked about these relationships, it was a very anti-black male, and it was interesting to see the young men in the back basically being beat up on, how they were responding to that. And it is important to see that you may have some inclination to accept that as we talk about our dysfunctional, some of our dysfunctional relationship from a male-female perspective, that has more to do with than just the genes of men, and more to do with the values and the purpose we see in relationship, or the lack of purpose, that they become recreational relationship as opposed to having a higher power. So you get certain dysfunctional responses if that is your purpose in going into a relationship. But what it does is create a very hostile environment for our sons. And we have to think about, shift our thoughts from just the male you sleep with, but start thinking about what words, what kind of world we're creating, not just for our daughters, but for our son. What are we telling them it means to be a male in this society? What models are we putting before them? If we constantly repeat to our sons, men aren't nothing, they're trifling, they're no good, or whatever, it becomes a part of what psychologists say, and I'm not in that field, but there's something called a self-fulfilling prophecy. And we talk about the power of no-mo. But as we begin to keep drumming this message into the heads of our boys, that you come from a trifling gender, that's no good, etc. and so on, we're creating destruction and making this become a self-fulfilling prophecy in many respects. But she recounted the story of two people, one male, one female. Both of them who slept around, well, both of them were in very committed relationships with people they loved and held in high esteem. But that didn't stop them from sleeping around continuously, which put their relationship in jeopardy. Now the young man, his experience was that his parents, he was raised by a single parent, and his parents were not together, and they would fight. And whenever they fought, the young man was sent by the mother to a family friend around the corner to protect him from, you know, hearing that negativity. But what the mother didn't realize, and the son never told her, is that when she sent him around there, he was being molested. He was being molested by the woman, her mate, and some friends they had there on a regular basis. And he never told his mother. But of course he was injured and damaged beyond that. So even though as he grows up, he's in a good relationship, it does not stop him from acting out. And people who deal with the area of people who are sexually abused, one of the manifestations is they become a person that's not automatically, but some in the way they deal with it, because they're damaged and hurt and injured, is they sleep around. They're looking for something, or for whatever reason, that is what they do. And so that was behind why he engaged in this behavior, and he wanted to change. And he was saying that her books have put in his mind that he should make that change. But one of the things she said is that she realized that some of these people coming from single parent households, did not want to go back and hurt their mothers by telling them what had happened to them when their mother had been trying to protect them and the damage that would do to their mother, to have to live with the guilt, or even though the mother is not guilty, how she would feel if she realized she had put her son in danger as opposed to protecting him. So that was part of the reason he never told his mother, but she was telling him that part of his healing process is he's going to have to stop holding it in and deal with it. On the other hand, she talked about a female who had a very negative relationship with her father because he wasn't in the home, and she saw him as a womanizer, and she hated him for doing that to his mother and hated the fact that he wasn't there. And so she always disdained the fact that he slept around. But as she became a woman herself, even though she had a good man, she engaged in the very thing she hated in her father. So that cycle of not just that cycle of dysfunctional ways of dealing with our experiences, you see manifested in both male and female. But in that discussion, the female was given empathy and the man was seen as a no-good womanizer, regardless of whatever the reason behind that. And so we have injured and hurt individuals, wounded individuals among us, and that's not to excuse behavior, but part of changing it is we have to break the cycle and begin to deal with that. And I'm saying that that feminist perspective does not give us a healthy way to move beyond finger pointing and to begin to have people become whole and healed human beings in a way that they can contribute in constructing and building healthy families and households. But it is important that we take the initiative to seize control of the rewriting of Black women's history. In the academy, it's not going to take place. Even though those feminists who are in the academy are small in number, they are strategically placed and they are engaged prolifically in rewriting our history. So most of the new books that are being published as articles, reference material on Black women is being rewritten from that perspective. And because this is now a strategic career move for many, in other words, feminists control women's studies and the academy, and that is not in your best career interest. But this is not about career. This is bigger and beyond career. We are custodians of this particular moment in history, and it is our obligation to be truthful to our ancestors. I gave a presentation talking about the fact that we will not tolerate any longer and begin to speak out against the domination of women's studies by feminist scholars at the Association of Black Women Historians, which had many of the top Black women scholars, as the academy ranks them, sitting in the front row looking dead in my mouth. And needless to say, at the end of that presentation, it was an interesting response, to say the least. I mean, but the level of pressure and veiled threats and not so veiled threats that I got, because many of them, because I am a part of the Association of Black Women Historians, felt that I was a historian. So that if I was a historian, in other words, I teach in the Department of History, I'm in the association, but really my degree is in African American Studies, and that's really the field I'm committed to building. But I teach in a history department, and they know, okay, well, when you start publishing those books, and when it goes out on review, and you start critiquing us, you're not going to get very far. So you may want to wait till your first or second book is published before you say the things that you're going to say, or that you're saying. And then Darlene Clark Hines to me said, and most of you probably know Darlene Clark Hines, she said that I was alone, and that I was going to be alone for a very long time. But what she didn't know, I'm not alone. And she is not the source of my power. But I have good home training. I don't respect the elders, and you know. But this is the importance of an institution like Ascac, to be independent, to be able to stand on our own power, to be true to ourselves. This is the importance and the value of Ascac, because, like I said before, when you talk about writing these women and changing them as the label of just feminists, those that they can't co-opt, then they choose to deal with it in a different way, and that is to marginalize you, to trivialize, to caricature you, and try to render you invisible. So they don't talk about people like Marimba Ani in women's studies. They ignore her. Okay, they go back to her when she was Donna Richards, and they try to co-opt that version of her. So if you read any of the recent books about the 1960s and SNCCs, you always see a little snippet of Donna Richards supported us, the feminists, etc., and so on. But they can't deal with Donna when she grows up to be Marimba. And so they totally erase her. Even though it's supposed to be scholarship by women, for women, etc., so on, they can't use that. That's not usable to build feminism. Urugu? No. All right? They don't talk about people like Vivian Gordon and where she stood. So they erase that genealogy out of the history of so-called women's history. And part of the problem that we have with black feminism is that they do not go far enough with their critique. They have an inadequate critique of white feminism. And one of the problems begins with how they choose to frame the issue of the problems and flaws of white feminism. The dominant way they choose to frame the issue is they say that the problem with feminism is a problem of exclusion, that they excluded black women from white feminism, and that is the problem that leads to why they label it as racism. But when you frame or characterize the problem as exclusion, then what becomes the solution? Anybody know? Inclusion. But that carries with it a lot of hidden assumptions. When you say you were excluded from something, to say black women were excluded from feminism would be akin to saying black people were excluded from the KKK. Because the presumption is we wanted to be there in the first place, and that is not the case. And so the problem is not that we were excluded, but the problem is how they conceptualize and talk about the problem and their assumptions and the relationship that they construct between men and women. One of the things when I went to a class and did a guest lecture, and they always start with the fact it was a feminist theory class, and they always start with the fact that black studies quote unquote excluded black women. Okay, now this is just the opposite. Of course we wanted to be there, etc. and so on. But what they don't talk about is the history of feminism, and I don't buy that assumption that black men excluded black women from African studies or African American studies. But when they talk about including gender to them look like a feminist setup. And so that's the only gender they recognize. And so when you go back to the history, one of the major tenets is that it had to exclude men. It had to be female only. It had to take a separatist approach. And so what they do is that early history said men must be silent, men cannot speak on this issue of gender and feminism, that only women can speak on it. And then fast forward 20, 30 years later, they use that, which they erased the fact that they excluded men, as evidence that men are anti-women, and ignore or don't bring out the fact that they radically excluded men from talking about and engaging in these issues. All right, and so that has an implication for how we conceptualize our role in recording and reconstructing our historical narrative relative to men and women. I would like to end by saying, tying it back into what Ida B. Wells said earlier, and that is history is memory. History is about memory. And so when we talk about our national memories, our collective memory, it is our responsibility to be the primary authors and the primary custodians of our memories, of our history. And each of us is charged with beginning that process of recording your story, to leave the materials for your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren who 50 years from now will want to know what was the African response to 911. What was our response to George Bush and the historical moment we in? All right, so we talk and we share, but we need to record in written form, in oral form. So to begin writing the story of your family. So even if you can't go back 200 years, you can record this moment, your sisters and brothers, your nieces and nephews, the story of this moment, and we begin to collectively archive that information. So we all have a role to play in reconstructing and preserving for the future generation the memories of ourselves and those whose shoulder we stand upon, and to know that one day the future generation is going to look to us to stand on our shoulders. Shimotep.